Hi everybody, it's Ginger and you're watching Gnostic Psych, the channel where I share with you the arcane and interesting related to psychology. If you like this video and my other videos, please click like and subscribe. And today I'm going to be talking about the ideology of TERFs, or Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminists, how their ideology is based on a flawed argument about biological sex and gender, as well as the TERFs' history they don't want you to know, which is their collaboration with the far right when it suited their political interests. Now, you may have heard of the acronym TERF in recent years by both J.K. Rowling and more recently with Dave Chappelle, but what are TERFs and what do they believe? In order to understand this, we must go back in LGBTQ history after the Stonewall Rebellion. And the Stonewall Rebellion, just to keep it short, was an uprising against basically police violence against gay and lesbian and trans bar patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York City in 1969. And this event was momentous enough to spark basically the worldwide gay, lesbian, and transgender liberation movements, which culminated in today's LGBTQ community. However, post-Stonewall, in particularly the early to mid-70s, there was tension between both the lesbian feminist community and the trans female community over basically whether, first off, trans females could be considered women and whether they could be considered feminists. Okay, sorry about that. Now, the trans community have been dealt kind of a crippling blow in the wake of the liberation movements. Whereas gay and lesbian activists were able to secure civil rights for both gays and lesbians, they kind of pushed away transgender activists because they just didn't think that transgender people were palatable for the heterosexual mainstream as far as being considered normal. And so it wouldn't be really until the beginning of like the 2000s when transgender people would actually come to be recognized and advocate for their rights. And it was around that time that basically there was a faction of radical lesbians within the feminist community who basically argued that trans females are nothing more than biological males that are posing as stereotypes of women that reinforce traditional gender roles. It was this faction that basically developed in today's TERF community within radical lesbianism and feminism. An early TERF ideologue, Raymond, wrote a book in 1979 called The Transsexual Empire, which was basically the key canon of TERF ideology as far as addressing the trans female issue. Basically, most of the book was a laughable conspiracy theory that trans females are the Stepford wives of the patriarchy. They're women imposters created by the male-dominated society with hormones and surgery in order to infiltrate and destroy the lesbian community by reinforcing traditional female stereotypes. Now, if the patriarchy is really trying to help trans females, they certainly have a confusing way of showing it with all these bathroom and sports bills being passed in recent years. However, amid the paranoid speculations, Raymond makes the argument that sex, or primary sexual characteristics like genitals, and gender, social roles based on sex, are inseparable. That basically trans females cannot be considered true women because they have male genitalia. However, this argument contradicts their argument, another argument they make, to challenge women's oppressive traditional gender roles by arguing that sex and gender are separable. By arguing that gender is a social construct, they validate the argument that trans females should not be considered women, since gender psychologists argue that sex and gender are separable. Conversely, by arguing that gender and biology are inseparable, basically that gender equals genitalia, TERFs invalidate their argument against historically oppressive gender roles for women, since basically their argument is that women's gender roles are rooted in their biology and are therefore natural, which is not the case, obviously. But the TERFs can't have it both ways. Either gender and sex are inseparable, or they're not. Further, by oversimplifying womanhood and manhood as mere genitalia, they don't factor in intersex people. Now, intersex people were formerly referred to as hermaphrodites. They're people that have both genitalia. By the logic of TERFs and essentialism as far as genitalia equals gender, intersex people would not refer to themselves as intersexed men or women, since they have both genitalia. Rather, they would actually have to be relegated to an entirely separate biological sex designation, which would be very silly. The TERF argument that sex and gender are inseparable was dealt a severe blow in 1984 when feminist and academic Judith Butler wrote the book Gender Trouble. Butler's book argued that, in short, gender is actually a performance based on socialization, rather than being statically rooted in biology. Now, any thinking person who has taken the time to read this stuff can clearly see that the TERFs are trying to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to using both the terms sex and gender. It therefore begs the question whether Rawlings and Chappelle have taken time to see the failed argument that props up TERF ideology, or whether they're just simply using their support of TERFs to merely hide their animus towards trans females. So if TERFs are only an extreme minority in the feminist radical wing, how have they been able to wield influence to define the narrative around trans women and the mainstream news media in the U.S.? It's because TERFs have been able to gain a platform and political influence through collaboration with Christian fundamentalists and right-wing politics when it suited their agenda. It was actually TERFs who worked with Christian fundamentalists and right-wing politicians to try and make pornography illegal by testifying in the Reagan-era Meese Commission on Pornography. It was TERFs who helped foment the satanic panic by working with Christian right activists and other overzealous child advocate crusaders in ruining the lives of innocent people with accusations based on no evidence. Also, they could save the children from the non-existent threat of satanic ritual abuse. Meanwhile, the time and attention and taxpayer dollars that could have been used to prosecute domestic abusers, the real menace, and help abuse victims was devoted to chasing a collective delusion. Janice Raymond, author of The Transsexual Empire, worked with the Reagan administration in cutting off government funding for transgender health care with her biased paper, Technology on the Social and Ethical Aspects of Transsexual Surgery. TERFs have been influential in crafting the current anti-trans bathroom in sports bills in various states. In their mission to help take away the rights of those whose lives threaten their ideology, TERFs are willing, apparently, to work with people who would take away the rights of women if given the chance. Many TERFs have also gained a voice in academia with their teachings on pseudo-intellectual sounding areas of study called gender critical. In the media, they've successfully used their influence in the American and British media to sow fear into cis women's minds that trans women are nothing more than sexual predators waiting in women's bathrooms and ready to attack them. In reality, the stereotype of the violent, mentally unstable transvestite or trans female who hates women is actually rooted in Hollywood myth, and there's never been a case of a trans female attacking cis females in public bathrooms. On the contrary, trans females are the victims of violence, harassment, and arrests by cis females in women's bathrooms. The side irony is that TERFs and their Christian right-wing allies refer to transgenderism as an ideology rather than reality, when in fact they are actually the true ideologues.